Okay, so this is the lecture on chapter 32, actually the first part of chapter 32. The second part from blood on, that's all, there's already a recording for that one. Okay, so this will just be chapter 32, part 1. And so this chapter talks about circulation and cardiovascular systems. And so remember that we're not only going to talk about the human cardiovascular system, although we will spend most of our time talking about that. We will also talk about transport, right? Circulation in invertebrates and in other vertebrates, and then focus on human cardiovascular system. Like I said, this section 32.4 is covered in a separate recording. Okay. So the intro to this chapter talks about cardiovascular related diseases, right? And it's also giving an example of an NFL coach. And so it says during November 2013, the Denver Broncos coach, right, John Fox, and also Gary Kubiak were both hospitalized for cardiovascular related issues. Okay. So in Fox's case, he needed surgery to replace an abnormal aortic valve. Okay, so he was diagnosed with this in childhood, and then it became scarred and narrowed, and basically it interfered with blood flow to the body because if you're talking about that aortic valve, right, the blood is leaving the heart through that, and that valve basically sort of covers that aorta. And so if there's a defect in it and blood is not able to readily get into the aorta, then blood won't be distributed throughout that body correctly, essentially, or efficiently. In Kubiak's case, he had something called a transient ischemic attack, or TIA, or mini stroke. And again, there was an obstructed blood flow to the brain. So we may sometimes think of a stroke as being it's going to cause a neurological disease, but really it's cardiovascular. Obviously, it causes neurological issues because the obstruction of blood flow is actually in a blood vessel in the brain. Okay. All right, so it says he returned to work when the clot that was temporarily obstructed blood flow to the brain was dissolved. So usually with a TIA or mini stroke, that obstruction is only for a short period of time, and you really don't have any cells dying or anything like that. And so usually there are no deficits as a result of it, but it does put you at increased risk to have a more major type of stroke later on. Okay, so both of these are examples of cardiovascular related diseases. All right. So moving on, like I said, we got to talk about circulatory system or circulatory systems in invertebrates first. We're not only going to talk about humans, but again, spend most of our time talking about that. And so if you just sort of define or what the term circulatory system is or what it does, it basically moves fluid between various parts of the body. In the case of our, cardiovascular system or circulatory system, we think about moving blood, right? But not all animals have blood. Okay, so here, small aquatic animals with no circulatory system, right? So there are really small aquatic animals that actually don't have a circulatory system at all because each cell in their body is actually exposed to the water in the environment and can independently exchange gases, right? Oxygen and carbon dioxide, and eliminate waste. So there's no need for a circulatory system to deliver oxygen and also to, get rid of waste because the cells do that themselves individually. Okay, so examples of that: sponges, cnidarians, flatworms. All of these guys don't have a circulatory system, right? But their cells are able to exchange, take in oxygen themselves and get rid of carbon dioxide and other waste as well. If we now talk about a group of pseudocoelomates, remember a coelom is a body cavity, and so pseudocoelomates sort of have a pseudo body cavity. So there is a certain amount of fluid sort of in their body cavity, and basically they use that fluid that's there to transport substances. Okay, and so some examples of those are nematodes. Nematodes, right, like C. elegans, which is a type of worm. Okay. If you talk about echinoderms, right, our example of echinoderm is a starfish. They rely on movements of that coelomic fluid, right, that fluid within the body cavity, as a circulatory system. Okay, so they're still kind of, circulatory system, just not what we think of as a circulatory system. Okay. For echinoderms too, it says may still rely on the body fluids for the purpose of locomotion. Okay, so that fluid in there, yes, will distribute gases and nutrients and things around the body, but also used for locomotion as well. All right, and so we can see a picture of this here, right, of some of the things that we talked about. So we talked about, if we talk about small invertebrates here, right, like cnidarians, okay, like the hydra, right, you guys saw a living hydra, they're super small. They're able to just exchange and take in anything that they need just from from both the cells in the internal environment and the external environment here, right? So that's what this is just showing you here, that things are just taken in, right? Nutrient uptake by endocytosis, meaning these cells are just taking in those nutrients that essentially just kind of end up in here, right? Or from the outside as well. Okay, so there's no need for a circulatory system because they're so small and those cells are close enough or exposed directly to the oxygen, right, or to the nutrients that they need. They then can directly take them in. For planaria, for flatworm, right, this is showing you this sort of gastrovascular cavity, right, and that there's circulation that sort of goes on through that cavity to be able to distribute nutrients to those cells. Okay, here it's just showing you an example of a starfish. It's not really focusing in on the circulatory system or anything. Okay, now if we talk about invertebrates with a circulatory system, a specific circulatory system, there are two different types of circulatory systems. Okay, so again, here we're these are sort of all examples of animals that really don't have a circulatory system per se. Okay, however, we can talk about invertebrates that actually do have a circulatory system, and we'll divide them up into two main categories: open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system. Okay, there are also two types of circulatory fluids that may be there: blood, okay, which would be contained within blood vessels, and then also something called hemolymph, which is a mixture of blood and sort of tissue fluid or lymph fluid that basically fills the body cavity and surrounds those internal organs. Okay, so an open circulatory system is more simple for it to evolve. There's a heart that will pump hemolymph via vessels, but then the hemolymph will just be emptied into tissue spaces, or sort of into kind of space. It doesn't stay contained within the vessels, okay? And then that hemolymph will eventually drain its way back to the heart. In a closed circulatory system, okay, the blood stays in the blood vessels always. It's never just going to empty into tissue space, okay? So all the cells of the body are basically in close enough contact from a capillary, right, a really small blood vessel, so that they can then get those gases that they need, the nutrients that they need, and then also be able to sort of get rid of things like carbon dioxide, and that can be taken back up by the capillaries, okay? So heart pumps blood, not first into the capillaries, right, into arteries, and then into smaller arterioles, eventually to the capillaries. All right, and I just said this: gases and materials can diffuse to and from those nearby cells. Okay? All right. Again, blood and the tissues never make contact with each other. The blood stays inside of those vessels. Okay? And so if we're just talking about invertebrates here, right? And giving examples of an open versus a closed circulatory system. You guys should be able to give me an example of an open versus a closed. You should know that, grasshopper was our example of an open circulatory system, where earthworm here is an example of a closed circulatory system. Okay, and so you can see here in the grasshopper, right, here's your heart. There are, there's a blood vessels here, or vessels. We won't call them blood vessels, right, because it's hemolymph in there, which is a combination of sort of blood and other kind of tissue fluid. And basically the heart pumps it out into these vessels, but then it just drains out into this space, right, into sort of this tissue space. And then it gets taken back up by the heart. Okay, so again, not closed, it's emptying into space here, into tissue space. Here in a closed circulatory system like the earthworm, okay, the blood, which is pumped by the heart, remains always enclosed in, showing this way, right, always enclosed in the blood vessels. And then cells surround these capillaries and are able to exchange gases and nutrients and what have you, okay? But that fluid, that blood that's inside the blood vessels never leaves, okay? All right, so now we can talk about transport invertebrates, okay? So that was in invertebrates. We gave examples of two examples of invertebrates that sorry, examples of two different invertebrates, one with an open circulatory system and one with a closed. Okay, so we should know the difference between the two. We should be able to give an example of an invertebrate that has an open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system. We should also be able to give an example of an invertebrate that does not have a circulatory system. Okay? All right, so let's move on. So it says all vertebrates have a closed circulatory system called a cardiovascular system, obviously like humans. If we talk about the vertebrate heart, there are atria and there are ventricles. So atria of the heart receive the blood from the circulation. Ventricles will pump that blood out, okay? In terms of different vessels, we have arteries. Arteries away, they carry blood away from the heart. Arterioles are smaller arteries, which then lead to the capillaries, like I mentioned before, okay? And then you have capillaries. It's in that sort of capillary network, or at that capillary level, that exchange of materials with the tissue fluid will occur, okay? The blood itself inside the capillaries never leaves. It's only the oxygen leaving, the nutrients leaving, right, by diffusion or by transport across the cell membrane, right? And then carbon dioxide is coming the other way. It's going to leave those cells, right, and end up in that tissue fluid, that interstitial fluid, which is essentially just the environment outside the cells, and then it will make its way back into the capillaries and then go back to the heart, right? Vanules, okay, join to form a vein. Veins will return blood to the heart, right? So this is kind of going in order. If you think about and we'll talk about this a little bit more, blood being pumped out of the heart, right, goes through the main artery, the aorta, through other arteries, then eventually arterioles, makes its way to the capillaries, gives off its oxygen, gives off all its nutrients that it has, and then at that point, also things are coming into those capillaries, right? And then you go into vanules and veins, and everything gets returned back to the heart, okay? So that's what this is saying here. All right, so if you look at some of these blood vessels and kind of differences in terms of the way they look, right? So if we look at an artery compared to a vein, compared to a capillary, I'm sure you can basically notice differences right away, okay? Particularly if you look at how thick the walls are of these three different types of vessels, right? So for artery, really thick wall, lots of muscle, right? So it's showing you smooth muscle here. This is elastic tissue and this is endothelium, and then also connective tissue on the outside, but you can see there's a really thick muscle layer, okay? There's lots of pressure inside the arteries. Again, this is where the blood is pumped from the heart into the arteries, right? And moving that blood away. So there's lots of pressure there. In veins, you notice that muscle layer is much thinner, okay? There's not as much pressure in those veins. If you also notice, there's also valves in the veins, okay? And so these valves are necessary to be able to return that blood to the heart. Because there's not a lot of pressure there, skeletal muscle and these valves actually help kind of make sure that that blood is moving in that right direction towards the heart, okay? And if you look at capillaries, there's no muscle layer, there's nothing. Why? Because things have to be able to be transported across these cell membranes here, right? And then with, again, around here is going to be other cells, right? All the body cells that need to get these nutrients, okay? So super thin so that exchange can occur. Okay, so if you look at this capillary bed, so like I said, all this exchange that's happening is at the capillary. So again, you can think of blood pumped out from the heart, has lots of oxygen, right? It's going to make its way to the capillaries, the capillary beds, and that's where that gas exchange is going to occur. So you notice it's changing from red to blue because now it's giving off its oxygen because it's the cells of the body that need the oxygen, okay? And so again, that oxygen diffuses across the membranes here and moves into this space where the cells then can pick it up, okay? It then gets transported across the cell membrane and the cells can then utilize that oxygen to make energy, right, to generate ATP. Okay, and so if you notice now on the way out, it's unoxygenated. It gave off all of its oxygen so that the body cells can use it, and now that unoxygenated blood is going to return back to the heart. Okay. All right. So we got to do a little bit of comparison here. And actually, we already did this. Okay. That should look familiar to you. We talked about this before, and I think I told you I kind of would come back to this. So in terms of comparing some circulatory pathways in different vertebrates, right? So fish, you have a single loop, one single atrium, and one single ventricle. In amphibians, there's a double loop, so there is a systemic circuit and a pulmonary circuit, 2 atria, but 1 single ventricle. And we'll look at the picture, and I'll just point this out in a second. Most reptiles, okay, there is a septum that will partially divide that ventricle, and so it sort of keeps the mixing of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood to a minimum. But in crocodiles, actually, crocodilians, that septum actually completely separates it. So you don't always have, in all reptiles, you don't always have complete separation and have 2 separate ventricles, okay? Birds and mammals, blood flows in a double loop. So you have 2 circuits, meaning a pulmonary circuit and also a systemic circuit here, okay? 2 ventricles and 2 atria, okay? So again, you can see this difference here, right? So 1 single atrium, 1 single ventricle, just 1 circuit, okay? Here you do have 2 separate circuits, pulmonary, right? Pulmonary meaning going to the lungs, and systemic, right? But there's only 1 ventricle, okay? So there's mixing of that unoxygenated blue blood versus the red blood here, right? However, if we talk about birds and mammals, we have complete separation of unoxygenated blood with oxygenated blood, right? 2 atria and 2 ventricles, okay? And we're going to focus more, obviously, on this now. Okay, right? So the focus of this next section is the human cardiovascular system, okay? So we start off talking about the heart. And also for your lab topic for this week, I'm giving you an assignment really just to label the parts of the heart. And then you're also just going to write on the back the path of blood flow through the heart. And so we'll go over that in class or in our Zoom class. But I just sort of wanted to give you a little forewarning. Oh, again, reminder, you should be writing all these notes on your review sheet. Okay, so human heart, fist size, cone shaped. It's located between the lungs, right, directly behind the sternum. If you think about, the only dissection we got to do was that frog dissection, and you can kind of think about kind of the positioning of that heart. It's muscular, right? Cardiac fibers, cardiac muscle. We talked about that. And it lies within this membranous sac that's called the pericardium. Okay, so in terms of the structure of the heart, there's a septum that will separate the heart into left and right sides. Okay, each side has 2 chambers. Okay, it has an atria, the upper chamber, and ventricle. Okay, and so atria are thin walls, they are the receiving chambers. Ventricles are thick walled, they are the chambers that will pump that blood out of the heart. Okay, so if you look at the external heart anatomy here, there's a bunch of things to kind of point out. Also, too, I will have there's a video posted about the sheep, showing you a sheep heart dissection, because we were going to do that in lab as well. And so you can see here, right, you can see here, here's the heart. So this is fetal pig. We also were going to do this in lab. I'll also show you some pictures and videos of this as well. But you can see the heart sitting here, and you can see the lungs on either side there, okay? And so, again, if you look at the external anatomy, some things to point out is being able to identify these major vessels, okay? And also sort of just sort of being aware of what these are here, right? So you guys see these vessels that are sitting on sort of the surface of the heart, right? So if you notice, it says right coronary artery, right? So these are vessels that supply the heart with oxygen and nutrients. Obviously, it needs a lot, right? It's always working. These are the vessels that would become blocked if you talk about a heart attack, right? And so if there's a blockage in the coronary artery, that's going to deplete the heart muscle cells of oxygen and nutrients. And then if it's for a long enough period of time, they will then begin to die. If enough of them die, the whole heart might stop working, right? Sometimes it might just be a small region of damage. Other times it might be more. In terms of us identifying, right, anatomy, so I will at some point quiz you on the anatomy of the heart, right? We should know some of these are the major vessels coming in, right? So the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, you can see here. So this is just bringing blood in from upper, right? From the head, the neck. This is everything from under the heart, right? And so the vena cava itself is a big, large vein, right? That basically returns all the blood from the body back to the heart. Okay, so you can see that there. So that comes into the right side of the heart, into the right atrium. All right, some other things to kind of point out here. So that was vena cava. You can also see pulmonary artery, right? Pulmonary veins. And so once that blood comes back in, we're actually gonna trace this path of blood flow. So I guess I'm kind of reviewing it now. We'll do it again. Okay, but once that blood comes into that right side of the heart, into the atrium, right? It then gets pushed into the ventricle. And from that right ventricle, it's got to go to the lungs because now it has to get oxygenated. Okay, so it will leave that right ventricle through the pulmonary artery and then go to the lungs, and then it will come out through the pulmonary veins. Okay, you can see them over here, right? Those pulmonary veins will then bring that blood into the left atrium, and then and you can see here, this is just the pulmonary trunk, right? That's kind of bringing these together here, okay? Pulmonary trunk, right? Or you can think of, yeah, so whatever. That's just pointing to here. But so the pulmonary artery, arteries are basically bringing that blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, okay? So it's blue, meaning unoxygenated, usually in the artery, right? Arteries are usually red. The only exception is really here, meaning that they have oxygenated blood. Here, the pulmonary arteries contain unoxygenated blood because that's the blood that just got returned from the rest of the body, okay? It still hasn't gone to the lungs to get oxygen, okay? So those pulmonary arteries bring the blood from the right ventricle to the lungs to get oxygenated. Then the pulmonary veins carry that blood that just got oxygenated from the lungs back into the heart, specifically into the left atrium, okay? And then they move to the left ventricle and they get pumped out to systemic. And the blood's gonna move through that aorta, right? And go to the rest of the body, and that's here, okay? And you can just see some of the arteries, the major arteries that branch off from that aorta there, okay? So when we look at, so anyway, here, I'd rather you, for the external anatomy, it's really identifying those major vessels that I sort of went over and knowing that these, you know, here's the right coronary artery here, right, showing you the left cardiac vein. Just know that this is, you know, the coronary artery, cardiac vein, and that these are vessels that are supplying that heart muscle with oxygen and nutrients. For identifying the ventricles and the atrium, it's better to do it with an internal anatomy diagram, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so yes, you will be responsible for identifying the parts of the heart. Okay, again, similar to what I did for the tissues, I will give you a lab quiz in which you will identify the parts of the heart. Okay, for the lecture exam, when it's all together with the other chapters, there won't be any identified parts in that. I'll keep it separate. Okay, so it'll be, again, the way that I did with the tissues and also like the body cavities and things like that. Keep it separate. Okay, so moving on, right? Now, I mentioned the atria, the ventricles, some of the major vessels, but there are also valves, okay, that are going to basically divide the heart up, right? And so the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, you may have heard of these before, right? The two main ones are the tricuspid, and it's called tricuspid because it has 3 cusps. And that tricuspid valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle, right? So there has to be a valve, there has to be think of it as a door, right, that can close and open, okay? Bicuspid valve is between the left atrium and the left ventricle, okay? And again, it's bicuspid because it has 2 cusps, and the other name for that is called the mitral valve, okay? Again, these are passageways between the atria and the ventricle. They have to be able to be closed sometimes, but also open sometimes. Likewise, you have valves that are in between those main vessels that leave the heart, right? So the pulmonary semilunar valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Remember I mentioned the pulmonary trunk and those pulmonary arteries that sort of then go off to the right and left lung. So the pulmonary trunk leaves that right ventricle and brings the blood to the lungs, okay? And so there is a valve between the right ventricle and that pulmonary trunk. Again, similar to that, there is a valve called the aortic semilunar valve, which is between the left ventricle and the aorta, okay? So we'll look at these in a little more detail here. So again, this is the diagram from which I would want you to be able to identify these, the atria of the ventricles and also these valves that we just mentioned. I also will probably include another picture for you of like a real sheep heart, because like I said, you're going to look at a video of a dissection of that and be able to identify these things from the actual sheep heart as well. Okay, so once we review for this, for the lab quiz where we're identifying parts from the diagram, I will also provide you with a picture of that sheep heart, and I may very well just add it to this PowerPoint. Okay, okay, so some things that we talked about, right? Right atrium. So remember, it's not the right side as you're looking at it, it's the right side as it sits within the body, okay? So here's your right atrium, right? Here's the right ventricle. This is the tricuspid valve that sits in between the right atrium and the right ventricle, okay? If you look at the other side now, this is the left atrium. Here's your bicuspid valve, and this is the left ventricle. Okay, and again, you can see the different cusps, right? Tricuspid, 3 cusps, and bicuspid, 2 cusps. The other thing is, if you notice how thick the muscle wall is in the left ventricle compared to the right ventricle. Much thicker on the left side. Why? Much more force there, much more force needed, because it needs to pump that blood into circulation, right? Into systemic circulation. Here, that blood is pumped out through the pulmonary trunk and is only going to the lungs. Okay, so there's not as much force required, not as much pressure inside there. Also, I don't know if this points out the semilunar. You can't really see it. Yeah, I guess it does here, right here, sorry. So this is just showing you semilunar valve. So again, this is the right ventricle, okay? So pulmonary semilunar valve, right? Pulmonary trunk, and then these are the pulmonary arteries that go to the right, you know, to the sorry, this is technically the right lung, right? And the left lung. So this is blood leaving that right ventricle. This valve guards that, goes into that pulmonary trunk, and basically then goes to the lungs, okay? If we talk about the aorta, I don't know if it's really showing you that. You can't really see that here. It's not really showing you that. So the aortic semilunar valve, right, is going to guard or be between the aorta and the left ventricle, okay? All right, so this is what I already sort of reviewed this with you, this path of blood flow through the heart, and we will review it again. You should review it yourself, and so on that review sheet somewhere, you should write down the path of blood flow through the heart, okay? And you're including the major parts of the heart, meaning the right and the left atrium, the right and left ventricle, and all the main vessels, okay? You also need to include, you know, systemic circuit, the lungs, right? You need to include pulmonary trunk, right? Or you can just say pulmonary artery, whatever. And then pulmonary veins are going to bring it back, right? And then you have aorta. So you've got vena cava, the pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary veins, and the aorta are the main vessels that you need to include as well, okay? So again, we will review this together as well. It says blood returning to the heart from systemic circuit, right? Enters the heart through the vena cava, okay? And goes into the right atrium. The right atrium then pumps that blood through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary circuit or into the pulmonary arteries and then to the lungs, right? And then it's going to come back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, and it's going to enter the left atrium, okay? That blood in the left atrium will get pumped through the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle. You guys need to know every single one of these details, okay? From the left ventricle, blood will be pumped through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta and then into systemic circuit. Once all that oxygen and nutrients gets delivered through those capillaries, the blood then comes back through the veins, through the vena cava, and it starts all over again, okay? So when I say path of blood flow through the heart, this is what I'm referring to, all of those details. So here they're leaving out a couple things. I want you to specifically say here, not just pulmonary circuit, say goes out, through the pulmonary veins or pulmonary trunk to the lungs, comes back, say pulmonary trunk or pulmonary arteries, right? To the lungs, pulmonary veins comes back in to the left atrium, okay? From the left ventricle, it gets pumped out through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, okay? So you just want to make sure you include those things there. So write those down. Practice it, pause it, write it down, see what you can remember. Okay. Again, oxygen-poor blood never mixes with oxygen-rich blood, okay? We already said all this. All right. Now, to talk a little bit more kind of about what's happening during heartbeat. Okay, so the heartbeat about 70 times per minute. Okay, and each heartbeat itself is about 0.85 seconds. Okay, and so there are some terms here. So systole, right, is contraction of the heart chambers, right? Contraction of that heart. Diastole is relaxation of those heart chambers. Okay, and so during each heartbeat, there is a cardiac cycle or a cycle that occurs in terms of how that heart pumps, right? So it says 2-part pumping action takes about a second, right? This 0.85 seconds we're talking about. So blood collects in the atria. Those atria contract to push that blood through the valves, right? Into the ventricles, okay? So it says this phase, the longer of the two, is called diastole, okay? Because the atria, though they sort of contract slightly, they're not, there's not a lot of pressure in there. They're not very thick walled, not a lot of muscle. And so basically those heart chambers are pretty much relaxed, okay? Second part begins after the ventricles fill. So then once those ventricles fill, those ventricles contract really strongly to push the blood into the pulmonary circuit or into the systemic circuit. And that's called systole. That's when there's lots of pressure inside the vessels. Okay, so when you're taking blood pressure, right, you talk about systolic and diastolic. The systolic has a much higher number. I think I have that on the next slide somewhere. I think we talk a little bit about it somewhere, but just in case. When you talk about systolic pressure, the reason why the pressure is higher is because that's during the time when those ventricles are contracting and basically forcing a lot of pressure into those arteries. Okay. All right, it says after the blood moves into the pulmonary artery and the aorta, the ventricles relax. Another term here, right? Cardiac output. This is the volume of blood in the left ventricle. Oh, sorry, the volume of blood in the left ventricle pumps per minute, right? So cardiac output is described as what is that volume of blood that's pumped out of that left ventricle per minute, okay? And this can vary, or this can be you can have increases in cardiac output that sort of help as you become more fit, things like that. Think about that, okay? All right, so stages of the cardiac cycle, this is what we just went over, okay? We have blood flowing in, right, through the vena cava, also coming in from pulmonary, basically entering into the atrium, okay? And then it's basically transferred to the ventricles, okay? So there's a slight contraction here of those atria to kind of move that blood into the ventricles. Once that, and this is showing you kind of this first, when you talk about listening to heart sounds, right? You heard about like sort of lub-dub. The sounds that you hear are those valves closing, okay? So here, blood is flowing in, semilunar valves close, okay? To trap that blood into the heart. And the blood moves. So here you can see, again, those atria are contracting, moving that blood into the ventricles. During here, nothing's contracted, right? Okay. And then you move over to here. Now, this is when those ventricles are contracting. And so super important that these valves are closed, right? Right as those ventricles are going to contract. If the ventricles contract and these valves are open, the blood's going to flow back into the atrium, okay? So if you have a leaky valve, you can see why that might be a problem, okay? And so that lub sound is those AV valves closing, and then that blood gets pumped into the aorta, right, and goes into systemic. And this is actually showing you this aortic semilunar valve. So if you make a cut, a cross section through, this is showing you the bicuspid. Like I said, I'll put up a couple more pictures of the actual chi part of the ventricles and stuff like that, so that we can be able to identify things from the actual chi part pictures as well. Okay, in terms of heartbeat a little bit more, right? We're still kind of continuing there in terms of what's going on. We all have heard the term pulse. Okay, so it says it's a wave effect, right? Passing down the walls of the arterial blood vessels when that aorta expands, okay, and recoils. So that pulse that you can feel, you know, in other blood vessels is because of what's happening when those ventricles contract, okay? All right. Now, the actual contraction of the atria and the ventricles in terms of what's coordinating or causing those muscles to contract doesn't have anything to do with the blood that's in there. It actually, there is a electrical sort of conduction system that's there. So when you think about muscles contracting, it's due to an action potential, right? It's due to, that's what's going to trigger that, okay? So there actually is this intrinsic conduction system, meaning the nervous system doesn't have to always be innervating these muscle cells directly. And so there is something called an SA node that keeps that heartbeat regular, right? It makes sure that that the atria and the ventricles are contracting when they're supposed to, okay? If they get out of sync, that's a problem, right? Okay, and so the SA node is called the pacemaker. There's also another node called the AV node, which actually signals those ventricles to contract, okay? So it says input from the brain can increase or decrease the rate and the strength of the heart contractions, but without innervation from the nervous system, the heart can still have a sort of characteristic rhythmic beat, okay? So there is an internal system that keeps it going. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are hormones or neurotransmitters that can basically stimulate the heart. So if you think about, you know, stressful times or fight or flight, your heart is beating really fast. That heart beating really fast has to do with the actions of epinephrine and norepinephrine that are actually released by your adrenal glands. Okay, so there's obviously a lot more that we can say about regulating heartbeat in all of these things and about the internal conduction system of the heart, right? And so we'll take a little bit of a look here, but there are a lot more details that we could talk about, okay? But it's probably beyond the scope of our class right now. One way, though, that you can measure this sort of electrical activity in the heart, right, is called an ECG, or sometimes you see EKG, an electrocardiogram, okay? So the electrocardiogram is not measuring blood flow, right? It is measuring the electrical conductivity of the heart, okay? So it's basically a recording of those electrical changes that occur in the myocardium, right, the heart muscle, during a cardiac cycle. Okay, so that SA node triggers an impulse and it actually forms this characteristic wave on the recording, okay, called the P wave. And so that P wave then indicates that the atria are about to contract. And so these, like the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave are characteristic parts of that EKG that clinicians will look at to make sure that there is not an issue in that electrical conductivity of the heart. Okay, and so if a wave is missing or something's delayed or something like that, it indicates a problem, right? And so then would probably lead to, you know, more tests. Okay, so this QRX complex signals that the ventricles are about to contract and that the atria are relaxing, and the T wave is due to electrical changes that occur as those ventricular muscles are recovering. Okay, so if you look at that here, that's what this is showing you, right? We said the P wave, QRS, and T. Okay, so like I said, if your EKG doesn't look like this, kind of in a sort of rhythmic fashion, right? Or there's delays, or the peak is missing, or something like that, it indicates an issue, right? So this is just showing you this normal EKG or ECG. Here, this is a major problem, right? So this is ventricular fibrillation, right? You've probably heard of that before. So VFib, right? Or AFib, probably heard that on medical shows. And so basically what's happening is that ventricle is just fibrillating, it's not generating the action potentials and the electrical that it needs to be able to contract. So essentially those ventricles aren't contracting, right? They're in this kind of weird fibrillation pattern. That's obviously life-threatening. You're not going to last very long if you're in VFib or AFib for that matter. And so what do? You need to shock that heart, right? To get it back into its normal rhythm, okay? And so, if you guys have heard of, AED, if anyone's CPR trained, though the presence of those AEDs has saved a ridiculous number of lives, because you can give somebody CPR until you're blue in the face, but if this is going on, the only thing that can get it back into its normal rhythm is shocking it, right? And so this is showing you this electrical conduction system here. So here's the SA node, right? And then AV node, and basically you can follow it around. So it's just showing you kind of where the contraction is occurring here, right? So the SA node is sort of stimulating the atria to contract, but then we're going to move on to the AV node from there. Okay, again, we can get into a lot more detail. I don't want to keep going with this. Okay, a little bit more just to kind of compare some of the circuits, right? The pulmonary versus the systemic circuit. And I kind of talked probably about most of this already. Pulmonary circuit takes oxygen poor blood to the lungs and returns that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart, right? The left side of the heart, so that it can be then pumped into systemic, okay? So oxygen-rich blood from the heart to the tissues, okay? And then it comes back in through the vena cava. I mentioned these coronary arteries before, right? When I showed you that picture of the external anatomy of the heart, right? Those coronary arteries themselves supply oxygen and nutrients to the heart muscle itself. We talk about a heart attack, it is a blockage in one of these arteries. Here, it mentions a portal system. Don't worry about that, okay? We can just kind of just leave it for now, but essentially there are specific portal systems, like a hepatic portal system in the liver, that it takes blood from the intestines directly to the liver, okay? So basically blood from the capillaries goes through veins to another set of capillaries without going back to the heart. So it's just something that's a little unique in terms of the way it's set up, okay? But I'm not really gonna ask you too much about that, but this is what that's showing you here, this portal system, right? So you can see here, it's going to the digestive tract, and then, so there's a capillary network here, and it's going directly to the liver, then going back, okay? So that's that portal system. There's other portal systems as well. That's one example. All right, so this is showing you that path of blood flow and kind of showing you all the things we talked about all along, right? And so you can kind of talk yourself through this diagram here, right? We talk about blood coming through the vena cava, right? Both superior and inferior, coming into the right atrium, right? Then it gets moved into the the right ventricle, goes to the lungs, right? Comes back in through the left atrium, moves into the left ventricle, and gets pumped out through that aorta to systemic circulation, right? And obviously now it's showing you some's got to go to the head, the arms, the upper body, and this is going down to the lower body, okay? So we talked about this. This points out some other major arteries, right? Like the carotid, the jugular, that are going to bring that blood from, essentially the heart to the upper extremities, okay? All right, so I did tell you that I know there was something that mentioned blood pressure. So I sort of alluded to this before. We were talking about the contraction of the heart and sort of the heartbeat, right? And when we talk about systole, that's when the ventricles contract, okay? And so systolic pressure, when we talk about taking blood pressure, right? Systolic pressure results from blood forced into the arteries during that ventricular systole. Diastolic is when the ventricles are relaxed, okay? And so you can use a instrument called a sphygmomanometer, if you could say that 10 times fast, right? A blood pressure cuff on the brachial artery, the upper artery of the arm, and you can measure blood pressure. And so we have some blood pressure cuffs, or if somebody has a blood pressure cuff, you might want to try it out. And so basically, right, you get a reading, Okay, in the readings, here's an example, 120/80. Okay, what does this represent? The higher number is systolic because that's higher pressure. That's when those ventricles are in systole or when they are contracted. Diastolic here, those ventricles are relaxed. So the lower number is diastolic pressure. This is systolic. Okay, so this is showing you a semi-normal reading, right, of blood pressure, 120/80. Okay, and it's just to remind you, it's measured in millimeters of mercury. Okay, I think we already kind of talked about all this. Oh, so one thing to mention here, and again, I mentioned this and I alluded to this in the beginning of the lecture. If you talk about the blood pressure inside these different vessels, it is much higher in the arteries, right? I said that blood pressure in the veins is really low, and it itself is too low to move blood back to the heart. Okay, so there needs to be some help in there, and that help comes in the way of valves, right? But also skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscles that surround the veins actually help push blood towards the heart, okay? And again, then once that blood kind of gets pushed past a certain valve, the valve closes to prevent backflow, okay? So it says varicose veins will develop when valves become ineffective, and so you get kind of pooling of blood. There's other disorders or conditions that are caused by sort of poor flow of blood in those veins, okay? All right. Again, this is another thing that basically, or another mechanism that helps move blood towards the heart, right? So this is called a respiratory pump. Variations in the chest cavity during breathing, right? So those variations reduce pressure in that thoracic cavity. And so because there's lower pressure in that thoracic cavity and there's higher pressure in the abdominal cavity, that allows blood to move towards that towards the lower pressure. And that itself also helps blood flowing, or helps blood to flow back to the heart, okay? All right, so this is kind of summing up some of these things that we talked about. I don't expect anyone to memorize this or anything at all, just a few things to kind of point out. This is showing you blood pressure, right? So you can see it's much higher in the arteries. Also showing you velocity here. Okay, if you look at the capillaries, right, you can see that the velocity is much lower, the blood pressure is much lower, and then same thing, low in veins and venules. Okay, so blood pressure is high, velocity is high in the arteries. If you, oh, sorry, you're following the capillaries. Okay, so each line, right, we're sort of following along here. If you look at the sort of, oh, sorry, this is cross. Okay, so each line is a different thing. This is blood pressure, this one is velocity, and this is cross-sectional area of the vessels. So these capillaries have a really high cross-sectional area, right? There's many capillaries, extensive capillary networks, lots of surface area, right? Or cross-sectional area, however you want to think about it. Not a lot in the arteries, right? But a lot in the capillaries. So you can kind of follow each one of these lines. Again, blood pressure, as it moves from arteries to arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. Velocity, and then cross-sectional area. Okay? So this is what I was telling you before about veins and the movement of that blood back to the heart, that it's the valves and the skeletal muscle are also involved, okay? So it says contracted skeletal muscle pushes blood past an open valve, and then that valve will then close, and therefore the blood cannot flow back, okay? So you can see how both the valves and the skeletal muscle are involved in moving that blood towards the heart through the veins, where there's not a lot of pressure in those veins, okay? All right, so just to talk about, and we've already talked about some of these already, diseases associated with the cardiovascular system, right? So leading cause of death in most Western countries, we've heard of high blood pressure before, hypertension, right? So these are all things that are related to the cardiovascular system. I usually do ask you at some point on the exam, you know, about diseases related, or being able to identify or list a few of these diseases related to the cardiovascular system, okay? 30% of Americans have high blood pressure or hypertension, and it says it's caused by narrowing of arteries due to atherosclerosis, which we will talk about in a second, which is essentially accumulation of fatty materials between the inner linings of the arteries that will narrow those arteries. Think about like a hose, really wide or kind of large cross-sectional area of a hose. If you narrow that, the pressure inside that hose is going to be greater. It's the same idea with atherosclerosis and hypertension, okay? And so the deposits that form these fatty materials are called plaques, okay? And so you can then get a clot or a thrombus that can form there on that arterial wall because of those plaques, okay? And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. Stroke, disruption of blood supply to the brain, okay? So this is when you have a blockage in an arterial that supplies blood to the brain, right? And depending on what brain area is affected, that will then dictate what neurological symptoms you have. If we talk about this is just a term for a painful sort of squeezing sensation that's due to oxygen insufficiency. So it's due to partial blockage of a coronary artery, and then sometimes that might be resolved on its own. Okay, so term for this painful squeezing sensation that may happen during a heart attack, right? So for a heart attack, myocardial infarction, the coronary artery becomes completely blocked. You can, fix that blockage by adding a stent, right, which is basically a wire mesh kind of tube that can be inserted in that blocked artery to keep it open. You also can do bypass. If it's, if the heart attack is severe enough, there may not be time to do any of these interventions, okay? All right, so like I said, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about these plaques and that's the last slide, and how this atherosclerosis occurs, right? So you think about like high cholesterol as being a risk factor, right, for cardiovascular disease. Well, the reason is because if you have, extra sort of bad cholesterol circulating around, it can then lodge itself and get stuck and accumulate in the blood vessels. And actually, the way it accumulates is actually underneath or in between the wall of that vessel, okay? And so then it causes narrowing of the artery and obviously higher blood pressure, okay? And can become completely blocked. Also, what can happen is this can burst and go somewhere else and then get lodged in a smaller artery, right? Like a smaller arteriole in the brain and cause a stroke or somewhere else, okay? So if you have more, the more sort of plaque accumulation that you have around, it's going to put you at greater risk, not only of just blockage of that particular artery, but there's a high or increased chance that this is going to be able to break away and then cause a blockage somewhere else, okay? And so there is more on this. This is, again, one of those little sort of extra kind of inserts in the chapter that talks a little bit more about this, but I wanted to you guys should kind of understand how this is happening. Again, you can get bursting of this. It can then go and lodge itself somewhere else. And so that's why it's even more dangerous, right? Not only where it is at that moment, right? Or sort of where it kind of has a tendency to accumulate, but it can then go accumulate somewhere else as well. Okay, so like I said, the next part of this is already recorded. Okay, so I will end there. And again, reminder, there's definitely a lot of information in this chapter, okay? Make sure that you are writing all these notes down in your review sheet as you go through. You've done the homework questions. You're able to write out that path of blood flow through the heart by yourself, right? Also, we want to be able to identify the main parts of the heart from those diagrams that are in here, but also I will provide you with some pictures of sheep heart. You'll look at a video of a sheep heart dissection, and we should be able to identify those major parts of the heart from there as well. And I will specifically tell you which parts I'm going to hold you responsible for. And pretty much from the sheep heart, it's the right and left atrium, the right and left ventricle, maybe some of the main vessels like the aorta or the pulmonary trunk, and then bicuspid and tricuspid, and it will be clear on the diagram in terms of what what it is. Okay, so I'll make sure I give you those guys either in a separate little, probably in a little separate PowerPoint that just has those pictures on there. That would be on that lab quiz again. Okay, so the sort of next topic for lab was going to be sheep heart dissection. And so our lab quiz will be on identifying the parts of the heart, either from, again, these pictures, some of the pictures that I have here, right? This one or this one. And not every single thing that's listed, but what I drew your attention to. And then also some actual pictures of the actual sheep heart as well. Okay? And so I will leave you there. Thanks.